this video, we're going to go over the selection tools. The selection tools are literally tools that allow you to select an area in anticipation of doing something else. Maybe you're filling it, cutting it, copying it, but the thing we're going to focus on right now is the different ways to select things. So if you go to the toolbar, the first tool on the toolbar is the Move tool, and that is really helpful once you have something selected. The second tool houses variations. So we have rectangular marquee, elliptical, and then single row selection tools. And you know it's a selection tool because it has this dotted line around it. The lasso tool is also a selection tool, and it houses multiple variations of that. And then the selection tool, object selection tool, quick selection, or magic wand tool are the third in the three different selection tools. So if you have something that you want to pick up, just a geometric square or rectangular shape, this is what you would use for it, the rectangular marquee tool. So maybe I want to pick up or change just a square of something. That is me selecting it. As long as I'm on the right layer, I'm selecting this sunset. If I want to deselect something, I can do Command or Control D on the keyboard, or I can go to the select drop down, and this is where you find things like deselect, reselect, inverse, etc. So there's a lot of variations with selection tools. If I want to do a perfect square, I can change the style from normal, which is me eyeballing it, to fixed ratio, which 1:1 ratio would give me a square. 1:2 ratio would give me a rectangle, and it's forcing me to that proportion. I can also do a fixed size. This is especially good if you know that you have to print something, and you can say, I want to have an 8.5 inches by 11 inches, and it would allow me to select something that will fit onto my paper. Okay, going back to normal here. The other thing about the selection tools is when you select something, if you move to select something else, it undoes the first selection, unless you either use the tools along the top here, which allow you to add to your selection or subtract from your selection, or create a combination from your selection, or you can temporarily hold the Shift key down to add and the Alt key to subtract. Everywhere in Photoshop, the Shift key helps you add things, Alt key helps you subtract, and you'll find that over and over again. If you want to deselect, again, you would hit Command D or Control D, depending if you're using Mac or PC. You can combine different selection tools. So let's say I want to select a square shape, and then I'm going to move over to the ellipse. If I want to add an elliptical selection to this, I would just hold the Shift key down, see the plus sign, and add something elliptical to it. I'm not going to do anything with this selection because this video is just about making selections, but I am going to move on to the next tool, which is the lasso tool. So the lasso is great if you want to get an irregular shape. So let's say in this red sky, I wanted to select just this one cloud, and I'll stop here for the sake of brevity. I can select just one cloud. If I want to remove parts of the selection, I will hold the Alt key down. If I want to add to parts of the selection, I would hold the Shift key down. So anywhere with the selection, Shift adds, Alt subtracts. There are other lasso tools here, like the polygonal lasso, which is helpful if you're trying to do a geometric shape, and it gives you the option to use a lasso, but click points and then double click to finish a selection. Or the magnetic lasso, which kind of infers a shape as you go past it. Now, depending on the clarity of your image, you might not be able to use it as easily, but if I deselect this and go over to the apple, you'll see what I mean. So I'm loosely following the edge of this shape, and the computer is figuring out what I mean based on how close I am to this shape. So it did a quicker, better job than I might have done with a lasso tool, but it's not perfect. It's not perfect because things like the shadow play into it. So let's say I've selected this with the polygon or the magnetic lasso, but I want to touch it up a little. I personally would go back into the lasso tool, hold the Alt or the Shift key, depending if I'm adding or subtracting, and go in and refine my selection. Sort of shaving away at it. You'll notice with the lasso tool that I'm doing a looping type of mark with it so that I can just create a barrier around what I want to keep or subtract. And I can always zoom in closer if I'm trying to refine this. So you might notice that I'm using the keyboard to select the lasso tool or the zoom tool. So I'm hitting Z on the keyboard plus the Alt key to zoom out. And then when I want to go back to the lasso tool, I'm just hitting L on the keyboard. So lots of shortcuts to learn about. So this is probably as good as it's going to get during this tutorial. So if I want to zoom all the way out quickly, I can double click the hand and you'll see that I have selected the apple. New to Photoshop is something that I'm going to show you next. We've always had this quick selection tool and the magic wand tool, but object selection is new. I want to show you the difference between magic wand, which works with the settings on the top here. Let's say I want to select this apple. You can see that it said, oh, the apple is the same red as that sunset, so let me select everything. Well, if I want to only select something that I click on until it runs out of boundary, I would hit contiguous. And this is selecting one thing at a time. If I wanted to add to that selection, I could hold the Shift key down. Okay, that's probably not the most efficient way of selecting that. If I do the same selection here, you'll notice that because contiguous is on, it's only selecting up to a certain point to the end of the solid shape and stops before it hits the disconnected little specks of the same color. If I wanted to get all of that, I would take contiguous off, and of course it's going to jump over and get a lot of the other reds in this image, but it is selecting every single red that I clicked on of that spray. So if I do this and I want to deselect the other things, also possible using the lasso tool with the Alt key, and I'm just going to get rid of that selection, so I've only selected this. So there's a lot of adding and subtracting when it comes to selections. So that was the magic wand tool. But the quick selection tool that's been added is also really helpful. Let's say I just want to get that leaf. Well, based on the quick selection tool, when I went to select it, I'll do it from a closer zoom, based on the size of the brush that I'm using, it's basically saying, oh, I see what average thing you're talking about, let me get all of it. And it stopped when it got to the stem. So I'm going to use a smaller brush here, hold the Shift key down to add, and say, you know what, actually, let's add this stem as well. It's a little hit and miss depending on what you're working on because you can accidentally add too much. Sometimes I'll use it and then go in with the lasso tool and start refining my selection. So the last tool is something called the object selection, which would work perfectly for something like this apple, although we're not sure what's going to happen with the shadow at the bottom. So the last one I'm going to show you today is object selection. Photoshop, as it gets into new and new versions, really starts to anticipate what we need as designers. So selecting that, and it did an amazing job of not picking up the shadow. It, however, did not see that this is not part of my selection. So here I would probably use the magic wand on contiguous. The tolerance, meaning how much it adds to the selection, should be lower. And then I'm holding the Alt key down to subtract, and you can see it got rid of that bit. So those are the main selection tools